It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC, live today from the Greene Space, our ground floor theater down here on Varick Street, and as part of the 10th anniversary Greene Space Marathon today. The first event was at 7 o'clock this morning, and there will be continuous content on the Greene Space stage until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, and all free. The Greene Space 10th Anniversary Marathon is free, so come down anytime today or pull an all-nighter here tonight. Not recommended for studying for finals, though. For the Brian Lehrer Show as part of the Greene Space Marathon. Oh, and I should say, listeners, when we're in the Greene Space, you can watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen, because we do live streaming video. So you can go to the WNYC website or the WNYC Facebook page. And for the Brian Lehrer Show as part of the Greene Space Marathon, I think we have some good stuff lined up. Actor Laurie Metcalf, who is currently playing Hillary Clinton on Broadway in the play called Hillary and Clinton. Save some of that applause for her. The playwright Lucas Hnath will be here too. He wrote that play. We'll have the popular activist and podcast host DeRay Mckesson here today. We'll have today's edition of our April series, Reefer Managed. Today it's a debate, legalization versus decriminalization. And to start us off right now, well, we begin as usual on Fridays with our weekly Ask the Mayor segment with Mayor Bill de Blasio. Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for coming to do this in person on the Greene Space stage.
I love the Greene Space. Happy anniversary, Brian. Thank you.
And happy anniversary to our amazing...
It's always a party at the Greene Space.
It's always a party. Sometimes very serious. Sometimes it's a party.
You can be serious at a party.
And we're going to do something a little different for this Greene Space Marathon edition. Usually we talk about things in the news of the week with the mayor, and we'll do a little of that. But mostly we'll take a step back from the news cycle and talk about some bigger picture things, including what a mayor of New York thinks about regarding the world outside the city when he's contemplating running for president. You are contemplating running for president as of today, yes?
I've said I have not ruled it out.
Were you one of those kids who grew up imagining yourself as president someday?
I spent more time imagining myself as a Major League Baseball player, but that did not work out. And there's no question I thought of, being a leader. I don't know how specific it was, but something.
What first really politicized you and gave you the bug for this kind of a career as a kid or a young man?
I think it was one part family reality, probably the biggest part, obviously. My dad served in World War II. He lost half of one leg on Okinawa. And so the reality of the world around us was present all the time in our family. And unfortunately, a lot of trouble, a lot of problems, what we would now call PTSD, but then we did not know what it was. So the world came home to our family that way. My parents had gone through McCarthyism, not as bad as some people by any stretch, but they had been victims of McCarthyism, and it had an impact on their lives. That brought it home. My oldest brother, Stephen, was draft age during Vietnam, so there were many nights at the dining room table worrying whether he would have to go to a war, which by then everyone knew was unjust.
How'd he get out? Bone spurs?
No, he got out normal. No, he was
not. Some
not.
of you got that.
He was not related to a president or U.S. senator, so he had to go through the whole process, and he did have a real health deferment. But all those things were very real. And, for me, I think it felt like, honestly, it wasn't even a question of whether you had to be involved in the world or try to do something to change it very aggressively. It was not, it needed a little change. It needed a lot of change.
So let's imagine you are the 46th president of the United States following Donald Trump. Before you even get to policy changes, what are some of the most important norms of American government and civic life that you think would need repair after he has taken a sledgehammer to them?
I think that's exactly right. I think we have to restore the notion of respecting all Americans, respecting all people. I think we have to restore the notion of common humanity. And that is easier said than done after what's happened here. But leaders are supposed to be unifiers, are supposed to be there for the entire community of people they serve. That will have to be put back into our national consciousness as the norm, because right now hatred is being given permission, white supremacy is being given permission. We have to very aggressively put that right back in the bottle and close the stopper and end that before it becomes even more dangerous. I think New York City is a very good example. We have gone through, you know, our challenges over generations. But in the last 5 years, we've consciously worked at repairing our social fabric and creating an atmosphere of respect. You can see it in the relationship between police and community, and it was so important to get away from stop and frisk, but a lot of other things, the neighborhood policing philosophy has helped to bridge that gap. You can see it in the approach we're taking to our Muslim community, which is respectful and inclusive and celebrates that community's contributions. You can see it in the approach to immigrants, the ID NYC, and all the other things we're doing to embrace our immigrant brothers and sisters, including undocumented folks who are our neighbors, are just as much New Yorkers as anybody else. That norm that you refer to, that norm of inclusion, respect, common humanity, it can be done. I don't have a doubt in my mind. It can be restored energetically, but it's going to take conscious effort.
But how much do you think Donald Trump is the cause of that, or how much is he a symptom of that? The fact that someone with his putting it out there on all that stuff the way he did very explicitly during the campaign was able to be elected. Maybe he's a symptom of a culture war that's been going on in this country since the 1960s or something like that.
I would blame Richard Nixon a lot more than Donald Trump if you want to go to origins, with the Southern strategy in 1968 and a very purposeful turn of the Republican Party to become a party of racial division. And Lee Atwater, I mean, we could go down the Willie Horton ad. There's a thousand examples.
But on the other side, then, does progressive Bill de Blasio have an outreach plan for those mostly white Americans who, rightly or wrongly, manipulated by Nixon and Lee Atwater and everybody or not, feel aggrieved and victimized by policies of the liberal elite that they feel is making their life, their lot in life worse?
I want to explain my views. And I said I'm not going to speak from the perspective of candidate unless at some point I am a candidate, but I'm going to speak about my views. I have felt for a long time that Democrats and progressives fell into the trap of being perceived as elitists and being perceived as not being focused on the needs of working people. And by the way, that's across the color spectrum. I think that's the original sin on the Democratic and progressive side of the ledger. It's inconceivable to me that a party and a movement that's supposed to be about equality and economic empowerment and redistribution allowed itself to be somehow painted as elite and did not fight back. And I think the timidity that came out of the Reagan era, I think it wraps around. I think it started in the 60s, 70s in smaller ways, but the bigger problem emerged with the election of Ronald Reagan. By that point, progressives, Democrats were back on their heels. It was the moment for a counteroffensive, not for a retreat. And unfortunately, we got a sustained retreat, which is why I'm so critical of the Democratic Leadership Council and others who urged moderation. It was desiccation. It was robbing the Democratic Party of its soul and its meaning. And so it just doubled down on the problem. And therefore, a lot of folks, working class people, again, across the spectrum, but I think it was particularly acute with white working class folks, they saw a party that decreasingly seemed to be willing to fight for working people, fight for labor, being willing to take on the 1%. They started to see Democrats in league with the 1%. You know, all the ways that it appeared the Democratic Party was a party of elites.
Do you consider yourself a patriot, or does that word not have a positive meaning these days?
No, I love that word. I love that word. I think, I say this as a matter of fact. We are a revolutionary country. We are a country born in revolution. We are a country born based on some extraordinary ideals. And if you go back to 1776, there's the cutting edge reality, the avant-garde reality of what the leaders at that time were thinking. They were far from perfect. I'm not trying to paint them with too rosy a brush, but I do want to say this is a country based on a set of ideals still in many ways extraordinary in world history. And the question in my mind has always been, how and when will we live up to those ideals? And sometimes we have, and many times there's been obvious contradictions that have to be addressed. But I love the possibilities of this country, and I love the humanity of this country. I've traveled this country throughout my life. And there is something beautiful in the American experience, profoundly beautiful. And the fact that we're a country also is based from our very origins on this. We had, very explicit decision. This is pertinent to today in such a powerful way. Country not based on having a state religion or even a favoring of one religion over another. I mean, that was an extraordinary concept in 1776. It is alive in the hearts of many people today, and others are trying to undermine it. But when you think about those ideals, and then you think about a country also based on immigration, it's explicit. The only way the country came to be, in some ways just and beautiful, in some ways obviously painful and unjust, including slavery and what happened to was done to Native Americans, there's still an underlying fact. It's a country made up of people who came together from all sorts of backgrounds, and there was some explicit hope in that, and there is even more hope today. But I feel like there is a battle we have to fight for the soul of the country. And it gets back to the question of norms. I think, yeah, sure, those forces have always been out there. That's not a surprise, but they need to be confronted. And they need to be shown that there is a change happening rapidly in this country. I believe the generations coming up are the most inclusive, tolerant, respectful, multiculturally minded. I think the generations coming up are going to save us, but we better fight for their ability to save us.
So if the liberal left has ceded too much ground, to paraphrase you from before, on who's elite and who's not, has the left in this country ceded too much ground to the right on the idea of love of country? You don't see liberals and progressives flying the American flag outside their homes very much, for example. And when some people on the right do, it's almost like flying a MAGA hat sometimes. So has the left in this country ceded too much ground to the right on the idea of your values or even the symbolism that reflects love of country?
You're asking a huge question. I'll try and get to a simple answer. I think, first of all, obviously you're asking about millions and millions of people, each of whom think differently. I can only express it from my own point of view. I think it's very important to express love of country and patriotism, but not someone else's version, everyone's own version. And because I still have great hope for this country. And I don't like to see, I'll flip it also to the previous question, I don't like to see cynical efforts by some to act that some are patriotic and others are not. I don't like to cede that ground. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's accurate. I think there's so many people of all different viewpoints who love the country and act on it in their own way. And I think actually if you look at our values as a country, there's no definition, just like there's no state religion, there's no definition of how to be patriotic, and I think the First Amendment explicitly grants the ability for everyone to have their own version of what it is to be American. But I, for one, believe that those expressions of pride have a lot of power, and in terms of saying to everyone, our fellow Americans, that we have a mutual respect. And I think it's important. I think it's an important message because, again, I say it from the heart, but I also say it in the best sense, thinking about how we move forward. I think there's a lot of good people out there asking, Brian, the question you just asked and wondering. And I want them to be reassured that progressive people love the country as much as they do, have as much hope for the country as they do, are going to fight for the country as much as they feel they have, and a lot of them have literally fought for the country, and they need to know we respect that sacrifice.
Well, let's take an Ask the Mayor phone call on line 4. Edward in Manhattan. You're on WNYC with the mayor. Hi, Edward.
Hello?
Hi, Edward. You're on the air.
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, thank you for taking my call. Just want to give a little pretext to this. Me and my girlfriend are homeless, and we can't afford any kind of housing whatsoever. So my question is, when is minimum wage going to match inflation rates to be able to afford housing?
All right, good direct question.
Sure.
When is, and I think we had bad sound quality on that call. I can't totally tell in the Greene Space monitors, but listeners, if you couldn't hear it, when is the minimum wage going to match inflation? And he related it to affordable housing.
So, look, first of all, a lot of us fought to get to the $15 minimum wage, and thank God we're there because it opens up a pathway for so many people. But minimum wage, it's a great question because we need to remember, and I'm saying this as a Democrat and a progressive, minimum wage is not the goal. Minimum wage is the floor, not the ceiling. We don't aspire for working people to get to minimum wage and stay there. We aspire to have a society where we set a minimum that's a realistic minimum and then go much farther. I think it's right that minimum wage should move with inflation for sure, locally, nationally, everywhere. But I think it is just the beginning of a bigger strategy. And again, there cannot be fear of the concept of redistribution here. We must tax the wealthy on a much greater level. We must change the way we are governed as a country and a city, a state, across the board, because the income inequality crisis is literally killing us. I say very bluntly, and I say it to be purposely provocative, I say there's plenty of money in the world, and there's plenty of money in this country. It's just in the wrong hands. It's just in the wrong hands. And that is that is because of government policies. We shouldn't kid ourselves. It started with Reagan, and it proceeded, remember the Bush tax cuts, and now, of course, what Trump and the Republican Congress did, which is the biggest giveaway to corporations and the wealthy we've seen in many, many years. So this is explicit. It's out in front. It's in the open. And unless that is radically reversed, we are not going to be able to address issues like the caller is asking. So I think we go back to the kind of tax rates on the wealthy during the time of that radical left-wing Marxist Dwight D. Eisenhower, and and which also was when the country was investing in education and higher education and transportation and science and propelled us into something of a golden age in terms of actual prosperity that to some extent was shared. We need to get back to that.
Do you consider yourself a democratic socialist? And if not, why not?
Social democrat, which is a difference and I think is important. We live in a capitalist society, and we have to address the many challenges and problems of capitalism. And I think social democracy is the way to do that. I think it is proven in the sense of a lot of Western European nations that have proven you can have a much stronger safety net, a much stronger, higher standard of living, a much more humane standard. One of the things we're talking about right now, we're going to pass it this year. Every other industrialized nation on earth mandates at least 2 weeks paid vacation for working people. We are going to pass a law in New York City doing the same thing, first in the country. We're going to mandate 2 weeks paid vacation for working people. That is a social democratic idea that says you put in place actual laws and mandates that protect people's quality of life, because right now, Americans, or New Yorkers for sure, are working harder and harder and having a worse and worse quality of life.
But just to be clear on the language, you reverse the noun and the adjective. Why does it matter, democratic socialist or social
because
democrat?
I think it's more precise. I think when you say social democrat, you're talking about actual countries that have traveled this path over the last half century or more, and you have real live examples of universal health care, of things like paid vacation, of efforts to actually put some guarantees in people's lives. Look at what's done on early child education and childcare in many countries that are thriving economies, or at many times at least have been thriving economies. They still work with a capitalist system, but they confront the problems of that system very, very aggressively, which has not been the history in this country, except for certain ways. The New Deal to some extent did that. We have to get back to that much more aggressive balancing. And since Reagan, it's been the opposite. Since Reagan, the worst problems of capitalism have been exacerbated. And the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the 1% has gotten absolutely out of control. So I use that phrase, Brian, great question, but I want to be just straightforward. I use it because I think it's the best way to understand what I actually believe.
Let's take another Ask the Mayor phone call on line 2. Beatrice on the Upper West Side. You're on WNYC with the mayor in the Greene Space. Hi, Beatrice.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you.
I'm calling because I wanted to first say that 99.9% of the time I agree with both you and the mayor, and that you're both extremely progressive.
We don't agree with each other 99%, but there's a math problem.
Let it go,
there.
Brian. Let it go. This is good.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Beatrice.
But I feel like when it comes to vaccinations, all bets are off and all rights go out the window. And I like that you're talking about restoring the notion of common humanity. But there is a real persecution going on in this country right now with anti-vaxxers. It really doesn't matter whether you personally want to get vaccinated, or if you have a religious exemption, or if you think it's poison. It's about a fundamental human right to have a choice about what goes on with your body. It's just like you're very supportive about a woman's right to choose. We have a horrible history in this country with forced medical procedures, with forced sterilization, and I really feel like you're going to fall on the wrong side of history here, because you have an opportunity to quarantine instead of forcing healthy people to get vaccinated with something where the disease could easily be quarantinable. And measles is not even considered a dangerous disease. It's not even like we have Ebola going on here. But if we had Ebola going on here, we would quarantine. It's a much more effective way to deal with it. And
let me jump in and get you an answer, because just for time. We did have the city health commissioner here earlier this week talking about, in her opinion, why it is dangerous with the percentage of children with measles who are now in the intensive care unit in New York City hospitals and things like that, though there have been no deaths in the New York outbreak. But, Mr. Mayor, she's asking a question of individual liberty.
Sure. And Beatrice, thank you for the question, because I think it's a powerful question, obviously a heartfelt question. But I think the challenge, so I'll speak as, the steward of the city. I'll speak as someone who has to think about the safety and health of 8.6 million people. And also someone who knows how important it is to listen to public health leaders, and those that I have brought into my administration, like Dr. Emmy Award, our deputy mayor, and Dr. Auxiliadis Barbeau, our health commissioner, are progressives who have devoted their entire life to serving at the grassroots and serving people in need, and they feel strongly, and I believe them, that there's a tremendous danger here that, if unaddressed, would lead to deaths and would lead to brain damage and lasting negative problems. So,
what about her policy alternative of quarantining those who actually come down with measles, rather than forcing everybody to get vaccinated?
I think I'm going to say I'm not one of the public health officials, so you should ask them about all of the nuances of quarantine versus vaccination, but I'll make the common sense point. We already have close to 300 cases. It's grown rapidly. We can't see all the places where the cases are. I don't think quarantine structurally is effective in a situation where you need something that gets to the root cause, not something that you address only when you find out it's too late, if you will. But I think there's a really crucial point about, I totally, of course, respect individual liberty, but there are times when we say that the safety of so many people has to come first. And remember, we are saying we have an order, and the only way we can enforce that order is with a fine, and it's a substantial fine. It could be as much as $1,000. But it is not arrest. Let's be clear to the individual liberty point. If someone still says, even in the middle of an outbreak, because we're not applying this standard if there isn't an outbreak, but even in the middle of an outbreak, I refuse, they have that right. But like many other things that we regard as dangerous in our society, we have a sanction. Doesn't take away their individual liberty, but there is a sanction because of the impact they could have on others. And I think individual liberty always has to be balanced against the needs of the collective and the safety and health of the collective.
Question from one of our Greene Space audience members. Does your administration have a concept of peak population for New York City?
It's a great question. I think right now we don't see a model that takes us much past 9 million, if you're talking between now and, say, 2050. I think that's where we believe we're going, and that we're going to kind of organically can't get a hell of a lot bigger than that under current conditions. And I think I believe certainly that's a tenable level. We can get to that level. It will give us challenges, but will also, I think, strengthen some things about this city. And this is one of the number one things going through my mind is this. The existential threat of our time is global warming. To address global warming, we must have people, whenever humanly possible, move closer to mass transit, move closer to where they work. We have to reverse the sprawl that has dominated so much of our country and all over the world. There is an underlying reality we have to change. And this city is one of the exemplars on the earth of a city you can walk around, a city you can use mass transit in. So from that point of view, we have to grow certainly some. But I think it's a great question to say, off in the future, after 2050, is there some maximum that needs to be enforced? I think it's a very fair question. I don't have that answer today. I think it's a very fair question.
President Trump just said the country is full.
Well, it's interesting. I heard that when I touched down in Nevada, and I had just flown over the country, and I was with an audience of progressive activists in Nevada, and I said, I just want to report to you, I've just flown over the country. I looked around, it is not full. There are a lot of wide open spaces. But let's get to the essence of that. The essence of that is it's a fundamental misunderstanding of our history and where we need to go. And I would argue that the American people are ready for a much more honest conversation about immigration. American people actually are not buying what Donald Trump is selling. They want, look at all the survey data, is very consistent. They want Dreamers to be allowed to stay. They understand that Dreamers are already contributing to this country and should be part of us. They do not believe in family separation. They do believe in comprehensive immigration reform. I think it's time for a counteroffensive where Democrats and progressives say, we need comprehensive immigration reform. We actually need immigrants coming to this country to be part of our economy, to be part of the life of this country.
And, if we really
and just one more thing, I'll tell you this from having been in Iowa. A lot of places, the crops are going unpicked. And you talk to people in Iowa, and they are not just thinking ideologically, they're thinking personally and practically. Their rural economy is being undermined. And I think people are ready for that mature conversation. There may be a subset of this country that can't hear that. I think most Americans can, and we should really go forward and say, this is where we need to go for the good of all of us.
A couple of things from the local news before we run out of time. News of this week. Obviously, there's the AOC wing of the party at the national level and the parallel movement of freshmen in the New York State legislature, considering the mainstream Democratic Party too passive and still too in bed with corporate power and things like that. And yesterday, Governor Cuomo's top aide, Melissa DeRosa, said that the threats of primary challenges risk being to Democrats what the Tea Party has been to the Republicans. I think that's exactly the point. Tea Party leverage over John Boehner and Paul Ryan helped elevate conservative principles more to national prominence. I think that those people in the new progressive wing of the New York State legislature think that's a good strategy for progressives, either in Washington or in Albany, and I'm curious where you are on that.
I don't agree with the analysis. I think what the Tea Party did, besides being incredibly destructive and a smokescreen, it was very much about the power of the 1%. Being treated like some grassroots uprising. It was not a grassroots uprising. It was the Koch brothers and all sorts of other forces engineering a rightward movement. What's happening with progressives in the Democratic Party is night and day from that. I think no Democrat should fear a primary. I think, and our party apparatus should get the hell away from interfering in primaries. Primaries are part of how we define who we are. And if you're an incumbent and you're doing your job and you're expressing real values, you should never fear a primary. So I don't buy this sort of purity test of, are you going to be involved in a primary? Are the consultants going to work on a primary? I don't like any of that. The progressive movement is a blessing. I think the folks in the progressive movement in this country are asking a lot of the right questions and pushing for a lot of the right things. Doesn't mean anyone agrees on, everyone agrees on everything. That's not the point. I think it's a good and healthy movement. And in the end, I think one thing I've seen about Democrats, despite our many foibles, generally we're able to come home and support whoever prevails. And I say it as a progressive, and I remind my brother and sister moderates, we many, many times as progressives accepted when your candidates won the nomination. And we loyally believed it was better to support the Democratic nominee than let a Republican win. I expect moderates to do the same thing when a progressive prevails. And I do think most of the grassroots voters and activists agree with that theory, that we're gonna have this discussion in the family and we're going to have a decision, and then we all come together for something greater. All
right, 3 things quickly, kind of lightning round style if you can. Charter schools, they are public schools, but there's an issue now of some of them using city-owned lists, if I understand the story correctly, for marketing themselves, which regular public schools don't or can't do? Are you going to stop that practice?
We're looking at that. I have real concerns about that practice, but we're going to make a decision on that soon.
The City Council passed a bill this week to stop testing of prospective employees for marijuana. I don't know if it's all drug testing or just marijuana. There would be exceptions for jobs that have to do with public safety or people who drive for a living, things like that. Will you sign that bill?
I will sign that bill. I think that bill is absolutely right because they made the right exceptions too. And I think it's part of how we change our culture to be less punitive and exclusionary. I think it's a healthy step.
And Gothamist just published a story yesterday, I guess this is circulating now, on the Museum of Natural History being rented out each year by a Brazilian group for a gala that honors a Brazilian and an American. And the Brazilian this year is Jair Bolsonaro, the right-wing nationalist Trump of Brazil, as they call him, as Person of the Year. And besides his public racism and homophobia, he's considered anti-environment. Apparently they hold this gala in one of the iconic, galleries of the Museum of Natural History. When I heard this, I thought I was back on April Fool's Day. They're going to honor Bolsonaro there. But it is a rental. It's not the museum itself doing it. They're just renting out the space. But the question is, even with that, should an institution that accepts city funding be hosting a private event in that particular
So this
instance?
goes beyond irony to like shocking contradiction. I mean, this is really troubling. This guy's a very dangerous human being, and he's dangerous not just because of his overt racism and homophobia, but because he is unfortunately the person with the most ability to impact what happens to the Amazon going forward. And if the Amazon is desecrated and destroyed as a part of our global ecosystem, we are all in grievous danger. So this guy needs to be invalidated and confronted at all turns. I believe in the First Amendment, so this is always a bit of a challenge. It's like the college campus issue. Should people be allowed to speak who have different views? Of course. But you have a very good point. If you're talking about a publicly supported institution and you're talking about someone who's doing something tangibly destructive, I'm uncomfortable with it. And I would certainly urge the museum not to allow him to be hosted there.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Mayor de Blasio for coming to the Greene Space in person on stage today. Mr. Mayor, thank you as always. Talk to you next week.
Thank you, Brian.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. More from the Greene Space Marathon after this.
WNYC is declaring April Listener Appreciation Month. We're grateful for all that you do to make WNYC possible. You listen, you participate, you share the stories you hear. To say thank you, we've created a special set of WNYC stickers that will send you for free. Get yours at wnyc.org/sticker, and thanks again.
Support for WNYC comes from Greenwich Entertainment's new film, Wild Nights with Emily. Molly Shannon stars in a role that portrays a vivacious side of Emily Dickinson, including a lifelong romance with her sister-in-law. Starts today at the Landmark 57 West and the Quad Cinema. The New Jersey Performing Arts Center presenting a trio performance with violinist Joshua Bell, pianist Jeremy Denk, and cellist Stephen Isserlis playing Mendelssohn, Shostakovich, Rachmaninoff, and Ravel. Sunday, May 5th at 3 p.m. Tickets at njpac.org. WNYC and its local and national news coverage are supported by the Jerome L. Greene Foundation, helping to make the arts affordable and accessible to all New Yorkers for more than 40 years.
WNYC, independent journalism in the public interest. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today, our ground floor theater down here on Varick Street as part of the 10th anniversary Greene Space Marathon. And I'll remind you again, the first event was at 7 o'clock this morning, and there will be continuous content on the Greene Space stage until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, and all free. So come on down anytime today or tonight if you are so inclined. I should report, as a journalist, that the mayor, after we finished our segment, went around the Greene Space shaking hands with people. You would think he was a politician running for something. And we're not even in Iowa. My next guest in the Greene Space Marathon is activist and author DeRay Mckesson, a leader on police reform and criminal justice. Now, for people unfamiliar, DeRay came to national prominence, helping to lead the protests in Ferguson, Missouri. I could say Missouri, and by the way, did you notice that the mayor said Nevada? New Yorkers say Nevada, unless they're running for president, I think. Or if you're in the media, and then every 4 years, when those caucuses come around, we say Nevada, and then we go back to saying Nevada. But anyway, DeRay came to national prominence, helping to lead the protest in Ferguson, Missouri, I'll say it like a New Yorker, following the 2014 police shooting of teenager Michael Brown. Coming on 5 years later, the impact of Ferguson is still reverberating through the U.S., even reaching beyond issues like policing and incarceration. Vox journalist Matthew Iglesias wrote that Ferguson likely has, quote, inspired a large minority of white Americans to begin regarding systemic racial discrimination as a fundamental problem in American life, unquote. DeRay's book is On the Other Side of Freedom, The Case for Hope, and he hosts the Crooked Media podcast, Pod Save the People. He also ran for mayor of Baltimore. DeRay, welcome back to WNYC and welcome to the Greene Space.
It's good to be here. It's great to be here.
What do you think of that? What do you think of that Matthew Iglesias quote? Do you think the Ferguson issue, the death of Michael Brown, launched an era when meaningfully more white Americans see racial discrimination as a current and systemic problem than before?
Yeah, so the polls actually suggested that is true as well. You know, you think about, people forget that we were in the street in St. Louis. We were in the street for 400 days. Is that people look back on it like it was a long weekend, but it was like a long 400 days, you know? And people also forget that it was illegal to stand still in August, September, and October of 2014, that if we stood still for more than 5 seconds, we were arrested. So when you saw us marching, it wasn't that we thought marching was like a cool thing to do. It was like we had to march, you know? So when you look at the attitudes about race right after the protests, like more and more white people started to say, like, okay, we think something's off here. You know, I will say that it wasn't until Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, and Walter Scott got killed that across the country, people were like, okay, I think something's wrong in America. For the first year, people were like, something's wrong in Missouri. And we were like, no, something's wrong like all across the country.
Although Eric Garner here in New York was that same summer.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting about Eric Garner, you know, we like de Blasio on a lot of issues, is that, and this is not his fault, but it's like the NYPD, there are lawyers in the NYPD who are saying that Eric Garner was not choked to death. Do you know the difference between a chokehold and a stranglehold?
I do not.
So the NYPD had banned chokeholds when Eric Garner was killed. But they are maintaining that he was not choked to death. And you're like, well, what is a stranglehold? A chokehold restricts your Adam's apple. A stranglehold restricts the muscles. And they're like, well, he was put in a stranglehold. And you're like, he died. You know, like both of those end in the same result. So we spent a lot of time trying to tease out those things. Like, what are the mechanisms that allow the police to never be held accountable? And it's those sort of things.
Well, if you want to kind of get granular about the Eric Garner case, I always thought that the real potential crime was not the way he was brought down necessarily, which is what the chokehold or the stranglehold, I think, refers to, but the fact that they continued to compress his chest when he was on the ground, when he was saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. I just wonder if you have a thought about the two aspects of the incident that led to his death, the takedown as opposed to the keeping down.
Yeah, I think that from a matter of accountability, it's like we want to know what the policy says. So if the policy bans chokeholds, then all of it is bad, and that's what we would say, right? That like all the things that came from the fruit of it are bad because we think that that was actually a chokehold. So it'll be interesting to see what happens because there's still calls for accountability. Like it's still in the pipeline. New York City is also one of the cities where you can't file a complaint against an anonymous complaint against a police officer. So if you call, what they will say is you can, and they are technically right. You can make an initial complaint against an NYPD officer anonymously. They can't actually press charges or ask for any accountability until you sign a sworn affidavit. And like nobody signing sworn affidavits against the police. You know, it's just not happening. And if we told the police that like you couldn't use any anonymous tips, they would be like, that's wild. We can never do our jobs. And we want to make sure that like across the country, people can actually file complaints against police officers because we think that's like a bare minimum.
So do you think, along with this new white awareness of systemic racism in the U.S., that there is also a new era in police reform. Certainly Mayor de Blasio and his Commissioner O'Neill would say it has become that in New York.
Yeah. It's interesting. People will say sometimes we're being dramatic about the police, and we tell them a third of all the people killed by a stranger in this country is actually killed by a police officer. The truth is dramatic, right? We're just saying it out loud for the first time for people. And, if there were fires spreading across your city, you wouldn't say, let's hire a lot of firefighters. You would be like, let's stop the fires. Like, why are fires starting in the first place? We would be like, let's get smoke detectors. Let's change, like, the materials that we build the houses with. But when crime increases, a lot of people are like, well, let's just hire more police. You're like, no. The goal is, like, how do we end the crime from increasing in the first place? That, like, the best that the police can do is get there after something bad has already happened. That is, like, what policing is. We want to make sure that things like poverty and addiction, which is like the cause of most of the crimes, we want to make sure that those things don't happen in the first place. And that's not a police issue. That is a before the police issue. In
fact, we have a clip of one of your fellow Baltimoreans. And Control Room, we're going to flip the order of the clips here since DeRay brought this up right now. So if you could cue up the Marilyn Mosby clip. New York is going in one direction on violent crime down. Baltimore, sadly, is one of those going in the other direction. Recently, the state's attorney for Baltimore City, Marilyn Mosby, was here, and she represents a wave of reform-minded prosecutors taking harder stances on police accountability while trying to fight crime. And here's what she said about New York versus Baltimore.
When you look at a place like New York and you look at a place like Baltimore, I think it's really incredibly important for folks to think about the root causes as to why crimes take place. But when we talk about the poverty, the concentration of poverty in New York and in Baltimore, it's very different. 24% of Baltimore's population lives in poverty. 35% of children live below poverty. There are over 18,000 vacant houses, 16,000 vacant lots. The unemployment rate for young African-American men between the ages of 18 and 24, which is more than twice as high than that of whites. When you look at the household median income of African-American families in the city of Baltimore, it's more than twice as low than that of whites. And so when you talk about that level and that sort of concentration of poverty, that's the difference between a city like Baltimore and New York.
Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby on the show recently. What'd you think of that answer?
Yeah, I think that I think the spirit of it is true. What the research suggests about New York City is that it's one of the only cities in the country where a decrease in arrests actually led to a decrease in crime. That is a huge win in New York City. Also, at the same time,
there was the stop and frisk program ending at the same time.
It was sort of, and it was like, to de Blasio's credit, they like under him, a lot of arrests ended. They did, like he still, we talked about it the last time I interviewed him. He still believes that the turnstile jumpers are like ruining society. So like we fight him on those, on like the turnstile jumpers. That he really, really cares about that. But the other arrests have gone down in a way that is actually meaningful. But it also, at the same time, there's an increase in services to communities that like was measurable. So it's this idea that like when you give people resources, they can make different decisions is not sort of novel. I would ask you though, what % of arrests do you think happen in the country for violent crime? At the national level, like across the country, what % of arrests happen for violent crime?
You tell me.
I want you to guess. That's the whole point.
I would guess that
putting him on the spot
is significantly below 50%.
It is 5%. So 5%, and that's an FBI number. That's not like something I cooked up. So if you think about 5% of the arrests in the country for violent crime, less than 5% are actually convictions. But if you believe that violence is everywhere, if you believe it's 40%, 50%, you're more likely to believe that the police are the solution. You're more likely to believe that incarceration like must be the answer. And the reality is it's 5% violent crimes, 12% property crimes. The rest are like quality of life things like disorderly conduct, trespassing. And like the reason that we sort of push people on those myths is that myths often reinforce a view of the world that reinforces the status quo. And like when you understand that it's 5%, that's just not, like when the police are like, they have a hard job, we're like, you do. But the majority of 911 calls are not bank robberies, Like it's just, that's not actually what's happening in communities.
But since you brought up the fare beating, I bet a lot of people, even in this audience, would say, but you got to pay your fare. We can't just let people get on the bus or jump into the subway like the MetroCard doesn't mean anything. A, the MTA needs the money in order to fix the subways. B, it's just a matter of, social good, everybody doing that, or nobody's going to do that.
Yeah, the MTA needs a lot more than the fare from the turnstile jumpers to actually like
Everybody
meet people's
agrees
needs.
with that.
But the thing is, in this, you need to pay your parking tickets too. You need to pay the parking meter too, and you're not getting arrested for not paying the parking meter, right? You're getting a ticket. So give people tickets. Like when they jump the turnstile, give them a ticket. I'm not saying it should be free. Like I get it, but it's like when you look at the data, it's literally like 75% of the people arrested for turnstile jumping are Black and brown young people. You know, it is a disparate outcome. Same thing with marijuana in New York City. 90% of the people arrested for marijuana are Black and brown, and we know it's not just Black and brown people smoking weed in New York City. You know what I mean? So we talk about the disparities in outcomes because we know that it doesn't have to be this way.
Listeners, we can take some phone calls for DeRay Mckesson, host of the Pod Save the People podcast. Came to prominence as a social and criminal justice protester in Ferguson, Missouri, almost 5 years ago now. He's the author of the book, On the Other Side of Freedom, The Case for Hope. And our phone number, 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. Or here in the Greene Space, you can raise your hand and we'll come around with a microphone if you have a question for DeRay. Getting back to police shootings, I have a stat here from the Washington Post Fatal Police Shooting Database, which they keep. It tracks fatal police encounters. And you were talking about the numbers surprising people. 264 so far people have been shot and killed by police in 2019, and it's April. That's outpacing the rate for 2018 and 2017 from what I've read. We don't know the circumstances of all these shootings, or this is not to say they're not justified. Or
I'm going to go and say they're not justified.
Or that they are, but with the public attention, why aren't those numbers falling?
So it's interesting, in the Post database, just as like a clarification, we like the Washington Post, struggle with the Post because the Post only logs people who were killed by the police with guns. So like Eric Garner's not in the Post database, for instance, because Eric Garner was not shot to death. There are a lot of people, like we think that Eric Garner should be in the database because he was killed by police. And so we struggle with their methodology a little bit. But what is true is that the numbers are going up. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. So the police killed more people in 2018 than 2017. I think that what's happening is that people confuse a change in conversation with a change in outcomes. We are talking about the police and police violence in ways we've never talked about it in public before, and people think that like that must mean something is changing substantively, and like it is not. When I think about like the what do we do, it's like we now know 5 years ago when we were in the street, we were like, we need better prosecutors, like better juries and judges. And now we're like, wow, there's actually just like a set of rules, policies, and practices that almost guarantee police won't be held accountable, and we get it now. So California, for instance, has a law that says that any investigation of an officer that lasts more than a year can never result in discipline regardless of the outcome. That's crazy. That's what the law says. In Oregon, the deadly force law, like the law that allows police to use deadly force, it literally says if the officer thinks you committed a felony or are about to commit a felony, they can use deadly force. You're like, that's anything, you know? A felony in Oregon is theft over $1,000. That means if they think you're about to steal a cell phone, you're like, that is wild. And 5 years ago, we just didn't understand the game. Like we thought that it was like bad DAs. And we're like, we actually get why some of the DAs don't prosecute these cases. Because if the law says that if they think you committed a felony or about to commit one, you'll never win that in court because like the law protects that.
I see you've been doing your podcast from the West Coast recently, LA, San Francisco, Seattle.
Did the tour.
And California has one of the highest rates of police shootings from what I've read. And yet this week they took a step toward becoming the first state to lawfully limit the police use of deadly force. Do you understand what they're aiming for?
Yeah, our research is actually undergirding AB 392. So AB 392, good thing. If you know people in California, tell them to call their legislators about AB 392. So California kills more people. So the rate, the St. Louis region has the highest rate of police violence in the country, but California just kills more people than any other state in the country. Yep. So AB 392 would change the law to say that they can only use deadly force when necessary. So right now, the standards in most of the country is like reasonable, which means that like if the police officer is reasonably afraid, but this would say that they have to know that like somebody is going to die essentially. And if they don't use force, then like somebody will necessarily die, which is different than the like loose standard of like, if you think a felony happened, which is what it's like all across the country. So Stephon Clark's family is helping to lead that fight. There is a coalition of legislators and activists who are working really hard to make sure that AB 392 gets a fair chance this year in California.
what will happen when something like that gets passed and police officers, in the heat of what they see as something possibly life-threatening to them, hold back, trying to figure out the difference between necessary and reasonable at that moment, and one of them gets shot and killed, and the public backlash?
Yeah, I want to believe that won't happen. I used to teach sixth grade math. I taught here in New York, in East New York, Brooklyn, in Start City. Sixth graders are great. And the police always say that they, but the police will say things like, well, they have to make split-second decisions. And we're like, you do, right? As a teacher, the research suggests that teachers make a new decision every 30 seconds. And if I kicked your kid down the stair because I was like making many decisions, you would be like, that's unacceptable. And like, we would say the same thing, that like, we were trained professionals and we had to deal with like young people who had temper tantrums, who weren't always like their kindest self. And like, part of my training was to like, be an adult and like to reckon with that. And we would say that like, if you're a trained professional, you do have to make a lot of decisions, and like, we can figure out how to de-escalate. The other thing is that if we didn't have examples of the police de-escalating white people, then maybe we'd be a little more swayed. But like, we've seen you use like bean bags. We've seen white people do all types of wild stuff, and like, they come out alive, And when I'm on panels with the police officers, I say to them like, do you have kids? And a lot of them do. And I say, when would it be okay for the police to kill your child? Like, what mistake would it be okay for your kid to make? And like, a bullet through his head is like the answer. And they're always like, well, my kid. It's like, if your kid can be talked off the ledge as a bank robber, then I think that every kid can,
I'm going to play a clip that you probably heard before and you probably hate. But even as awareness of systemic racism might be going up in the last 5 years among white people as a result of Ferguson and the protests and some of the other things around then, crime has been going up in some cities, like Baltimore, even as it's been going down in others like New York. And law enforcement people talk about a different Ferguson effect.
It's really arrests have been going up. Crime data is a little shaky. Arrests have been going up.
Before James Comey was famous for harming the Hillary Clinton campaign as FBI director and then getting fired by Donald Trump, he was known for describing a so-called Ferguson effect on police officers who didn't want to wind up in the news. Listen.
In today's YouTube world, are officers reluctant to get out of their cars and do the work that controls violent crime? Are officers answering 911 calls, but avoiding the informal contact that keeps bad guys from standing around, especially with guns? I spoke to officers privately in one big city precinct who described being surrounded by young people with mobile phones held high, taunting them when they get out of their cars.
Taunting them.
They said to me, "We feel under siege and we don't feel much like getting out of our cars." I've been told about a senior police leader in this country who urged his force to remember that our political leadership has no tolerance for any of you being involved in the next viral video. And so the question that's been asked of me is, are these kinds of things changing police behavior all over the country? And is that what explains the map and the calendar? The honest answer is, I don't know. And I don't know that that explains it entirely. But I do have a strong sense that some part of the explanation is a chill wind that has blown through law enforcement over the last year. And that wind is surely changing behavior.
James Comey in 2015. Anything to that in your opinion?
I think that Comey is incredibly good at being unhelpful. Like, every time he opens his mouth, you're just like, you just aren't helpful to anybody.
Wait, that line worked before the Russia investigation. Yeah. Does it still work?
Yeah, I mean, he caused it. It's like, so it doesn't help when later he's like, I was wrong. It's like, well, you got us into this mess. Like, thank you, Comey. What Comey didn't make a statement about was the gun trace task force in Baltimore City is a division of the police department. The entire team was indicted and convicted for conspiracies because they were literally breaking into people's homes. They were stealing out of their houses. You probably heard in Baltimore, this was right when the Ferguson effect thing, when Comey was on this rampage. In Baltimore, there was this idea that drug dealers were breaking into pharmacies and they were stealing medication from pharmacies, and like that was increasing all the deaths and all the violence in Baltimore City. Who was stealing the drugs? We found out it was the police later. That is like true. That came out in the trial. So Comey's pretty silent on those sort of things, but like it must be that violence is just because people in communities are being bad, as opposed to like what happens when the people that you think are supposed to be stopping the crimes are actually committing the crimes. Like they were literally robbing drug dealers. And the wildest thing from that story is that the only reason that we knew it was happening is that somebody got transferred onto the GTTF, which was the team. First day, the guy who leads the team, he says, will you come with us to rob these drug dealers? The new guy thinks that it's a test and that he's supposed to say no because, like, this is an integrity thing. He says no and gets transferred off the team. So then he calls the FBI, and then the FBI does the investigation. And it's like, you don't hear Comey talking about those people at all, you know? So no, we don't think that, like, and if you think that teenagers with cell phones is taunting police officers, then, like, I mean, we just live in a tough world if police officers are afraid that, like, kids have their cell phones out, you know? And that is the same language we would say in St. Louis, is that, like, we were armed with the truth in cell phones. Those are the weapons we had. Y'all had they had tear gas and pepper sprays and tanks. Like, we had the truth in cell phones.
Let's take a phone call. On line 8, Mayad. Mayad, you're on WNYC with DeRay Mckesson. Hi there.
Thanks for taking my call, Brian. And
Sure.
It's a culture. As to how the police started, as the Daily News pointed out, in terms of looking for slaves or gathering up free people to be slaves. And there's a similar situation, I think it was in Philadelphia, of corrupt, crime-ridden police. But my question is, DeRay, regards what you don't hear much about, because when Sessions left, he stopped any consent decrees, which you never hear talk about. But in Ferguson, they had a whole system throughout that general area of raising resumes by targeting black people for even sitting in their car, an unlicensed, unregistered car in their driveway, all kinds of crazy situations, and they had a debtor's prison. And my question is, do you know anything about that, and mention about Sessions stopping any consent decrees going forward? And I'll listen over the air. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayad.
Yeah, one of the good things that the Obama team did right before they left is that they essentially rushed all the last consent decrees through the court so that they would, because the way consent decrees work is, if you don't know, is that the consent decrees are really a relationship between the city and the courts. The DOJ just forces them to happen. Once the cities sign on the terms, and like the courts manage it, so the DOJ is just sort of a loose oversight.
So this is like in Ferguson, even though the police officer who shot Michael Brown was not convicted of a crime, the federal government found systemic racism in the way the police department worked, and they had to sign a consent decree, right?
Yeah, they call it like a pattern in practice. They found a pattern in practice of violations. So Baltimore has one right now, and the Baltimore one was one of the last ones signed under, like, right when Obama left. The city of Baltimore, the DOJ agreed, so the courts are monitoring the police department. So, you know, there are 18,000 police departments in the country. It's important that the DOJ, like, has oversight, like, actually holds them accountable. All those things are good. Sessions has done a lot of wild things that have gone under notice. So if you remember, Sessions also instructed the U.S. attorneys to ask for the death penalty for drug dealers. We'd never had that happen before. That was sort of an unusual thing, and that was one of his last memo. That was sort of a middle-of-the-road memo that he wrote, a middle-of-the-term memo that he wrote, which is sort of wild. So consent decrees are good. We want more of them. Hopefully they'll come back under the next administration. It's sort of too like the First Step Act. People talk about the First Step Act as like this radical thing. It's the First Step Act has the potential to impact maybe 2% of people who are incarcerated. The majority of things that got passed in the First Step Act actually could have been done administratively, but Sessions just refused to do them.
It is amazing that with the Attorney General of the United States and all that they're in charge of, whoever's in that job, that almost the only thing that got talked about in the media the last couple of years was the Russia investigation and Trump being unhappy with Sessions for accusing himself. Do you have any reason to believe that William Barr is any better on issues like this than Jeff Sessions, who we know was so old school in all the worst ways was?
You know, the hard thing about this administration is like the first people he puts in are really awful, and the replacements are worse. You're like, I didn't know we could get worse. You know, you're like, this is just, you know, I think the best quote I heard about Barr is that when he opens his mouth, Trump's words come out. It really is just like Sessions, he was like rogue, you know, he was like doing his own thing. This guy is literally like a puppet. And you're like, it is hard because you're like, you want these people to go. Like, I want DeVos not to be education secretary, but I'm like frightened for who the next person's going to be. You know, you're like, that is rough.
Let's go to line 7. Amir in Queens. You're on WNYC with DeRay Mckesson. Hi, Amir.
Hi, how are you guys today?
Good.
So I'm calling today because I'm an activist and organizer in Queens. I've been helping Black Lives Matter in Queens and in New York City as a whole. And I'm calling because I find it troubling that DeRay supported Hillary Clinton during the last election, even though she has a terrible record of criminal justice reform. She's called black young men super predators. So I find that very interesting that DeRay would support someone like that for president.
All right, let me get a response. Were you for her in the primaries?
When she was a nominee, it was so I didn't publicly support Bernie or Hillary. Like I voted, but didn't publicly support anybody. And then we pushed both the campaigns because. So here's the thing about the election is that like I believed him. I believed Trump. When he said he was going to do these things, I believed it. I was like, this is bad. I think he can win, and we got to do whatever we can to make sure that he doesn't win. So when it came down to like, how do I use my platform and influence? Like, I'm mindful that I don't organize, and I'm not an organizer and an activist in theory. Like, I understand that these things impact real people's lives. So there were a lot of people who were really frustrated with us in the end when she became the nominee, and we were like, we're supporting Hillary, because it wasn't like a theoretical decision anymore. It was literally like, I believe him. And I think that hindsight has shown that, like, we should have believed him a little bit more, right? So when I think about, so I'm really clear, too, that, like, I'm not an apologist for Hillary, right? That, like, the super predator thing was bad. That doesn't make sense, right? There were a lot of things about her campaign that, like, we didn't understand, and we met with her twice about it. We met with her first before there was a platform, pushed her team really hard, and in the end, it, like, actually made sense. I remember meeting with her in Cleveland after a platform came out, and I said to Hillary, I said, you know, you are calling for more police training, but, like, we don't think the police need any more money. Like, they get a ton of money already, so they should repurpose the money. So your training thing, how do we make sure that doesn't, like, just give them more money to spend? So in Baltimore, for instance, the Baltimore City Police Department is going to get $500 million this year from the city of Baltimore. The city of Baltimore only gives $30 million to the school system. So, like, they don't need any more money. And Hillary looks at me and she goes, you're right, they don't need any more money. They need to use the money they have. And you're like, that's the right answer, right? That is right, you know? So when I think about this conversation about how do we engage in politics, I'm mindful that, like, I don't organize in theory. I organize in practice. And in practice, she was the better candidate. I think that, like...
We're almost out of time with DeRay Mckesson. Let me do the legal ID here and keep us on the right side of the Federal Communications Commission, and then we'll finish up. This is WNYC FM HD and AM New York, WNJT FM 88.1 Trenton, WNJP 88.5 Sussex, WNJY 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio. The Greene Space audiences, when we do the show here, they always wondered, has he memorized that whole thing? And the answer is no. I'm reading from this piece of paper, even though you hear me do it every day. Is there any presidential candidate you're interested in thus far for 2020?
I think that the reality is with race and criminal justice, I think they're all going to come out to be the same in the end. Like, I think that this is just posturing now. Yeah, I think that on the left, on the, you know, the right, who knows? But I think the two issues that people will really differ on will be this question of, like, what do we do with wealth and extreme wealth? I think the candidates will be very different on the wealth question, as we see already with, like, reparations and, like, the billionaire question. I think the second question that'll become more important in a couple months is, like, what's our role in the world? I think this question of, like, Palestine, Israel, I think that, like, what does America mean in the world conversation is going to be, like, a big divide for the candidates. I think that with race, I think everybody's going to be like, let's free everybody from prison. Like, I think that the rhetoric around, like, the end of prisons is going to take up. I think that people are going to talk about policing. You know, if you remember in 2016, Bernie did that tweet that was like, he's going to free 1 million people from jail. There aren't 1 million people in prison at the federal level. So hopefully people do that better. But I think they'll be fine.
And last thing, I want to ask you about the subtitle of your book, which seems, I think, to a lot of people kind of straightforward, The Case for Hope. But to a lot of people, I think, it's really a serious thought, because I think hope is on the decline, you know? Obama got elected on hope and change, and then so many people became gradually disillusioned, and then, you know, exponentially more disillusioned when Trump got elected and with some of the other things going on in the country today. So as a serious question, what is the case for hope?
Yeah, I think about hope as a belief that our tomorrows can be better than our todays. And when I think about hope not as magic, but hope as work. And like when I think about why I'm still committed to this, it's like I think we can win. I really do. When I look at the tax rewrite that the right put through, it's like they literally did that in like 2 days. People didn't even read it. It's the biggest tax rewrite in a generation, and they did it. And it's like on the left, sometimes I worry that we fight for what we think we can get, not what we think we deserve. And when I think about like the win, it's like I really do think that we can like end mass incarceration in this generation. I want to be like 70 years old looking back being like, wow, that was a tough fight, but we did it. And like I think we can win. So when I think about hope, it's like a reminder that like, you know, sometimes we say that the system is broken, and people say, oh, no, it's not broken. It's working exactly like it was designed. And my takeaway from that is that it was designed. Like, people made this up, and because people made it up, we can make something better.
You want to plug anything coming up on your podcast, Pod Save the People, before you go?
No, just check out Pod Save the People. One of the things that we do, we don't cover like the news weekly because enough people are inundating you with Trump. What we do is we cover all the news you don't know for the week. So what are the things that have happened in the past week that you never heard about? So interesting, like one of the reasons why young people didn't vote absentee in the midterms was not because they didn't care, but because a lot of young people actually don't know where to buy stamps, right? And like, interesting. So we cover those sort of things that like you might not know, but we think that you'd actually be able to make better decisions if you did know.
What's a stamp? Please thank DeRay Mckesson.
Okay. Thank y'all.
Brian Lehrer with you live from the Greene Space Marathon here on WNYC. Quick reminder, you can watch us as well as listen when we're in the Greene Space. We're streaming live video at wnyc.org or on the WNYC Facebook page. And now it's time for the latest news. Live from the Greene Space stage, it's Richard Hake.
Hi, Brian. The White House considered going after political opponents by pushing U.S. immigration authorities to release detained immigrants in so-called sanctuary cities. 3 people familiar with the idea told the Associated Press that the Trump administration considered it, and Trump battled Democrats as he was over that border wall. A White House official said the idea was floated but rejected. Hillary Clinton is weighing in on Julian Assange's captivity. She says he needs to answer for what he's done. The 2016 Democratic presidential nominee and former Secretary of State spoke at an event last night with her husband as part of their speaking tour. WikiLeaks' publication of Democratic emails stolen by Russian intelligence officers during the election hurt Clinton's presidential campaign. WNYC has learned that a death at the Essex County Correctional Facility last August is under criminal investigation. Matt Katz has more.
Lucas Vieira was struggling with mental illness and opioid addiction when he violated probation and ended up at the county jail. A lawsuit filed by his brother alleges that due to guards' neglect, he committed suicide while wearing a straitjacket. Now, WNYC has obtained a death notification indicating that the matter is under criminal investigation for indications of neglect and record falsification. Hillary Nappy, the brother's attorney, said Vieira needed help.
He should have been being monitored very closely so that he wouldn't be able to successfully complete a suicide attempt.
The death notification was dated April 4th. State law says it was supposed to have been filed last August. The county executive's office and the prosecutor say every death at the jail is investigated.
New York State lawmakers held the first of several community forums on admissions to the city's selective high schools. WNYC's Jessica Gould reports at a meeting in Queens last night, attendees were largely united in their take on the controversial admissions process.
Offer more gifted and talented programs, build more specialized schools, but don't get rid of the SHSAT. The crowd of primarily but not exclusively Asian parents say the test is the fairest way to admit students to the specialized schools. But with only a tiny fraction of seats going to Black and Latino students, the mayor wants to eliminate the test and admit top performers from schools across the city instead. Critics argue that's pitting minorities against each other.
And lawmakers plan to hold forums in the other boroughs as well. The United States Postal Service is reporting that dog attacks on their employees went up by 10% in New York City last year. Linda DiCarlo is the safety director for the Postal Service, and she says it's important for dog owners to recognize that their pets may behave one way towards family members and another towards strangers.
When delivering mail to homes with pets, our letter carriers often hear, "Don't worry, my dog won't bite." Well, guess what? If your dog has teeth, it can bite.
And I brought a prop with me since we have a live audience today. My apologies to our radio listeners. The Postal Service is apparently sending out these postcards to targeted areas that have suggestions on how the mail carrier can get you the mail safely. And the front of the card is a hologram. So as I move it around, you can see nice dog, angry dog, nice dog, angry dog, big teeth, no teeth, nice dog. And the weather forecast today, a slight chance of drizzle before 2 o'clock, cloudy with a high near 61 degrees. Showers tonight with wind gusts as high as 25 miles per hour. Tomorrow, 30% chance of showers, and again, the chance of some rain on Sunday.
This is kind of a nice dog, angry dog weather forecast for the weekend.
That's true. A little windy and rain and sun, and that's the latest, Brian.
Thank you, Richard Haig. Please thank Richard Haig for the news. And again, folks, as a reminder, we are live in the Greene Space today, our ground floor theater down here on Varick Street, and not just any ordinary Greene Space show, but today it's part of the 10th anniversary Greene Space Marathon. The first event was at 7 o'clock this morning, and there will be continuous content on the Greene Space stage until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, and all free. And with me here on the stage for just a minute or two is the executive producer of the Greene Space, Jennifer Sendro. Hey, Jennifer, congratulations.
Hey. Thanks for being here, Brian, putting the glitter in journalism today in the Greene Space.
There you go. Somebody's got to do it, even though I don't know what that means. This is...
Well, turn around, Brian. There's glitter behind you.
Oh.
Sparkle.
Real sparkle. This is a 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. marathon. So tell everybody, what else have you got going in this marathon besides us that they might come down and see for free later?
Well, in the Greene Space, we're always bringing people into the best of WNYC and WQXR and Gothamist and WNYC studios, and we do our own original programming. So over 24 hours, we have a little bit of all of that. So after you, we have All of It with Allison Stewart. She's got Andrew Bird coming on, and one of our Greene Space artists in residence, Arturo O'Farrell, is also going to perform. She has a lot of great guests. WQXR will have a live broadcast with Conrad Tao playing some of the greatest hits of the 19th century and the 18th century, some Bach, some Beethoven, some Chopin. And then we have a taping of a new WNYC Studios podcast called Adulting. It's hosted by Michelle Buteau and Jordan Carlos. Their guest is John Cameron Mitchell. And then we've got Gothamist for the happy hour. Then, all night, we keep going. We've got Susan Laurie Parks in conversation. We've got the Ataka Quartet performing new music by Caroline Shaw.
I want to know what's going to happen at like 3 in the morning.
Oh, well, we've got comedians. They stay up all night. So we've got an up all night party with a whole lot of comedians curated by Josh Gondelman. We're screening movies, and we're going to wake up with some meditation. And because no 24-hour marathon is complete without a challenge, right now upstairs we have artists from the New York Opera Festival composing a 10-minute opera that we will premiere tomorrow at noon. And their challenge was the opera must be set on a New York City subway car.
So after the news in front of glitter, we're going to have opera in front of glitter.
All in front of glitter. If people want to come down and see us, they can come. It's free. You don't need a ticket. Just come to the Greene Space, or you can watch us online and you can see this glitter we're talking about. We're going to be online all 24 hours, and when there's not a show on stage, it'll be like a human ant farm.
And then the Greene Space continues hopefully for another 10 years and more. You gave us a good representation of the range of what goes on here, right?
Yes, and we don't do a spectator sport, so you can hear people laughing and clapping. You get to ask questions of the guest. You're never more than 30 feet away from the greats, including Mr. Brian Lehrer.
Okay, so listeners, audience members, will you join me in singing Happy Birthday to the Greene Space? Are you ready? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Greene Space. Happy birthday to you. Love the spontaneous harmony. You people are amazing. Please thank Jennifer Sendro for everything, the executive producer of the Greene Space. And the Brian Lehrer Show continues in a minute.
On the next All of It, we're hosting another live show in WNYC's street-level performance venue, the Greene Space. Our guests include Andrew Bird, who will be playing live with Madison Cunningham. Plus, Jonathan Colton will play some music off his new album of 70s soft rock covers, and a tap performance by Ayodele Cassell and Heidi Schreck on what the Constitution means to me. I'm Allison Stewart. Don't miss All of It weekdays at noon on WNYC.
WNYC is supported by The Town Hall, presenting Baba Maal, Senegalese singer-songwriter and vocalist of Wakanda on the Black Panther soundtrack, Saturday, May 4th at 8 p.m. Tickets available for Baba Maal at thetownhall.org and Ticketmaster.com. Cohen Media Group presenting the new film Girls of the Sun, inspired by the true story of a Kurdish battalion of female fighters who rise up against extremist invaders, starts today at Quad Cinema, Landmark 57 West, and FIAF's Florence Gould Hall. John Thurer Cancer Center at Hackensack University Medical Center, part of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Hackensack Meridian Health Partnership. Learn how John Thurer Cancer Center is pioneering the possible at jtcancercenter.org. Join a discussion on local news coverage and share your feedback about WNYC at New York Public Radio's Community Advisory Board meeting, Wednesday, April 17th at 6:30 p.m. in the Greene Space. Details at wnyc.org/cab.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone, live from the Greene Space in its 10th anniversary marathon. And now we continue with our April series, Reefer Managed. All this week, we've been looking at cannabis legalization as a social and criminal justice issue, as New York and New Jersey's governors are both still aiming for recreational legalization in the next few months. We will keep covering all things weed every weekday through next Friday, April 19th, and then remember our 3-hour national call-in next Saturday, April 20th, called Ask a Legal State. I'll be co-hosting with Anne-Marie Awad from the legal state of Colorado, and we'll see what we can learn from the experience of the 10 states plus Washington, D.C. that have already legalized. That'll be next Saturday, 4:20 from noon to 3 on WNYC and public radio stations across the country. Today, right now, we're going to have a debate. What's the best path forward? Decriminalizing marijuana or completely legalizing it? Sometimes the words are used interchangeably, right? But they mean different things. 14 states have moved toward decriminalizing marijuana but not legalizing it. So possession of small amounts of pot no longer carries criminal penalties like prison time, but possession of larger amounts or trafficking, including sales for recreational purposes, remain criminally illegal. And of course, decriminalization laws vary from state to state. Marijuana, as I said, has been fully legalized in 10 states, plus D.C., and we're in a tricky moment in the United States where it seems like the marijuana train has left the station, but in terms of public health harm reduction, who gets the profits from legal marijuana sales, and restorative criminal justice, we're all still running to catch that train, or so many Americans and American states are. So let's have a debate. Our participants are Dr. Kevin Sabet, founder of the anti-legalization group SAM, or Smart Approaches to Marijuana. He's on the decriminalized side. And Maria McFarland Sánchez-Moreno, executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance. She will be debating for full legalization. Welcome back, Maria, and welcome, Dr. Sabet. Hi.
Thank you so much. Hello.
Thank you.
And let's start with opening remarks. Maria, we're at a crossroads here in New York and New Jersey. What do you see as the right approach in terms of dealing with cannabis and the law?
Well, thanks so much. I'm first delighted to be here. We have been running a campaign to legalize marijuana in New York. New York has decriminalized marijuana, has had decriminalization for decades now, since the 1970s. It hasn't worked. In the last 20 years, 800,000 plus New Yorkers have been arrested for marijuana possession, even with decriminalization in place. And that's because police have found ways around decriminalization. And our view is that the best way forward is to remove criminal penalties for marijuana entirely, and instead establish a responsibly regulated market with a strong focus on protecting health and public safety, ensuring that you can label products, that you can control what their content is, their potency, so that consumers know what they're getting. You can have strong restrictions on advertising and protect minors. And you can also reduce the size of the illegal market so that you can tax the revenue from marijuana sales and reinvest that in the most impacted communities, which is what the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act that is now being debated would do. The idea is you regulate, you expunge or clear the records of people who have past convictions for marijuana offenses. You reinvest in the communities that have been most harmed by prohibition, which are overwhelmingly Black and brown communities in New York. And you find ways to create market access for those communities. You have small licenses, you have other ways into the market that restrict the ability of big industry to control it.
All right, Kevin Sabet, I think you have a definitional challenge, as I said in the intro, to even explain the difference between decriminalization and legalization. So why don't you start there and then make your case?
Sure, and there is a big difference, which isn't. So I appreciate the nuance, and it's just a pleasure to be here down the street from where I live, and a happy 10th to the Greene Space. So it's a real honor for me, and also to be with Maria. Even though we might disagree, my old boss, President Obama, told me we can disagree without being disagreeable, and I think that that's something we should try and listen to these days. You know, I think that there's a big difference, first of all. Decriminalization is, essentially removing criminal or civil or other penalties, including, cause for arrest, obviously incarceration, for, let's say, personal possession amounts of marijuana. In Vermont, which is often called legalization, that's actually more of a decriminalization because they don't have legal stores in Vermont. They don't even have McDonald's, I don't think. So they said, if we don't have McDonald's, we don't want to have a pot shop selling 99% gummy bears, which I think makes sense. But you're allowed to grow a small amount, and that's kind of in the middle of the two. Legalization is really the commercialization of marijuana. That's the difference. And legalization allows selling. And so the critical difference is on with one end, you're allowed to possess it. Maybe you grow your own. Maybe you get it from a friend. In fact, most people get their marijuana from a friend or family member for free. It's not like some massive drug deal going on. Or legalization is to sell it. And the reason I think we should essentially remove criminal penalties, but not legalize, is because we already have legal drugs. They're called alcohol, tobacco, and OxyContin and the other opioids. They're led by multi-trillion-dollar business interests who lie through their teeth with tobacco for 100 years about the harms of smoking. We knew smoking caused cancer in the 1920s. The government didn't acknowledge it until the 60s. The tobacco industry didn't pay for it until the early 2000s. Now big tobacco with vaping is making more money than they ever have. So don't feel too bad for them, even though we've reduced smoking, because of the vaping issue and also the issue of marijuana, which they're fully invested in. I do not think we need the commercialization of 99% THC gummy bears, edibles. This isn't your old joint from Woodstock. I really could care less if an adult smokes a joint and falls asleep on a Friday night. What I don't want is Philip Morris Altria, which is what they're doing. They've invested $4 billion in Canada, investing in the pot business. And I think we have to learn from our history. Tobacco was a relatively benign drug before big tobacco came on board. We didn't have lung cancer deaths before 1880. So they made it a more harmful drug. That's what the pot industry is doing today.
So you think that if there's a legal pot industry, it's going to make marijuana itself more harmful to people's health?
Absolutely.
As a substance, the substance will get worse?
No doubt about it. Pablo Escobar did a lot of horrible things. One thing he didn't do is invent the pot gummy bear. One thing he didn't do is buy off all the special interest lobbyists in these states that are working it. And the reason New York and New Jersey have slowed down isn't just because of some random event. When you have the PTA, when you have every major medical association in this country saying, do not do this, and when you have the Black Caucus very split, because it is not uniform in the African American community that this is going to be a wonderful thing, because when they look at alcohol, they see the social injustice of that. They see the liquor stores that are 8 times more likely in a poor community, a poor Black community. They don't want to see that for marijuana.
Let me clarify to some listeners who may not get the reference. When he talks about pot gummy bears, it's a kind of edible. In the legal states, they sell, gummies that are THC infused, and there's a concern that that's going to be attractive to children, just like with I guess the flavored tobacco products and Juul and stuff like that. So what about those particular concerns, Maria?
So the MRTA, the New York bill, actually bans the sale of edibles that come in shapes that are attractive to kids. So you wouldn't have pot gummy bears in New York. That's a red herring. The other issue is that the illegal market already reaches people across New York. 12% of New Yorkers use marijuana. That hasn't gone down. That number has fluctuated over time. And right now, those New Yorkers have no way of knowing what's in the products that they're buying. There's no labeling. If somebody cooks pot brownies, you don't know what the potency of those pot brownies is. There's no tamper-resistant packaging for children. All of the benefits that come from regulating a market and adjusting as you see threats to public health are not there when you have an illegal market. I also want to hit one other point, which is around this issue of decriminalization. We at DPA ran for many years a bill in New York to decriminalize or to fix some of the problems in New York's decriminalization, try to close some loopholes. That would have been inadequate compared to marijuana legalization, but it was a way to reduce the harm, and it was what was politically feasible. Right now, we are running campaigns in places like Savannah, Georgia, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or New Orleans. I don't see Sam coming out and supporting those campaigns. I didn't see you celebrating when we decriminalized in New Mexico a couple of months ago. So I have to question whether this is really about you supporting decriminalization or just that you don't like legalization.
Well, here's the issue. First of all, there's a fallacy that we have regulation in states that have legalized marijuana. There have been hundreds of thousands of individual recalls of marijuana products that are totally mislabeled when they're tested. Remember, we kind of forget that little tiny thing called federal law. And federal law, it means all of this is illegal, any state that's doing it. The FDA is not looking at it at all. And we don't know what's in it. And the black market, the underground market, is thriving in legal states. The idea that drug dealers, when you legalize it in a state, say, oh, you know what, we're going to go pursue dental school now. We're done with our drug dealing. No, they sell to the people the legal market won't sell to. They sell to the kids under 21. You still have a thriving black market with some of the largest segment of users because there's an age limit. You also have these guys that are undercutting, the drug dealers, undercutting the legal price because it's taxed, because people think, well, we're going to make some money off of it, which I'm still waiting for the alcohol, tobacco, and other revenue to fix our schools. I don't think we're #1 in the country yet. I don't think teachers are overpaid personally because of all the wonderful alcohol revenue. So that's a false thing that we're going to get money and pay for all these wonderful things. It never happens. But the issue is on, when I see someone like John Boehner, this is really important. I worked for President Obama for 2.5 years trying to get criminal justice reform in, and it was blocked at every level in the House when John Boehner was Speaker because he was afraid of the Tea Party.
Now he's a marijuana industry lobbyist.
Thank you. Making six figures
Did you know that,
a
folks,
speech.
about John Boehner?
And you had to delouse his office because of how much he smoked, because he was on all the boards of the tobacco industry, and so now he's getting them into the pot industry. So the issue is, I don't want people arrested. Let me be very clear. I do not want kids going to prison for pot. I don't want them to get a criminal record. I don't want them to be arrested. I don't want to stigmatize. But at the same time, let's not forget, this is also a problem for some users, not everybody. Right. But today's pot is different. We have a health issue to deal with. And I just worry about legitimizing it and throwing it to corporate America, who, last time I checked, put profit over public health in everything that they did.
We have to take a short break. We'll continue in a minute with this decriminalization versus legalization debate. And Maria, when we come back, you can respond to that point on the notion of, if there's big pharma and there's big alcohol and there's big tobacco now, there's going to be big marijuana trying to push their product on as many people as possible and the potential harms from that. Stay with us, Brian Lehrer on WNYC.
Today's the day. We're celebrating 10 years of the Jerome L. Greene Performance Space with a 24-hour marathon of special events. Come see live radio shows and music performances, plus late-night comedy and movies, ending early tomorrow with a morning meditation. It's all free and happening right now. Find the schedule and RSVP at wnyc.org/marathon. Then come on over.
WNYC supporters include Glen Mead, an independent trust company providing investment and private wealth management services to individuals, families, endowments, and institutions. More from Lee Miller at 212-328-7331. IFC Films presenting Red Joan. Based on a true story, Judi Dench stars as a woman in her 80s who finds herself accused of having leaked nuclear secrets to Russian spies during the final months of World War II. In theaters April 19th.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today. Coming up, when we're done with this decriminalization versus legalization debate, we will have the actor Laurie Metcalf, who's playing Hillary Clinton on Broadway right now in Hillary and Clinton, and the writer of that play, Lucas Hnath, so that's coming up. But we continue with Kevin Sabet, founder of the anti-legalization group Smart Approaches to Marijuana, arguing for decriminalization instead, and Maria McFarland Sánchez-Moreno, executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, arguing for full legalization. Greene Space audience, if you have a question for either of them or both of them, you can raise your hand and we'll come around with a microphone. Callers, we might get to one or two of you at 212-433. WNYC 433-9692. I'm just curious. I mean, this is a random audience of people who just wanted to come down here and see us do the Brian Lehrer Show. I imagine since we're in Lower Manhattan, a lot of politically liberal people here. On either side of the question that we're discussing right now, how many of you would say you're for decriminalization as opposed to full legalization? Very few. And full legalization? Okay, and a lot of people still figuring it out for yourselves. Raise your hands. Yeah, interesting. So quite a bit, probably the largest of the three groups was those who haven't made up their mind. Very interesting. So Maria, on the point that Kevin was raising just before the news about big pot trying to push it on people more and more, like the alcohol industry, or take your pick.
Yeah, so I think that there are two ways to deal with the industry problem, right? You can either try to regulate them very aggressively and create a system that limits the power of industry, and that's what we're trying to do with the MRTA in New York. So you don't have vertical integration in the bill in New York. That means that no industry can control all the different pieces of the trade, no single industry actor. We have micro licenses to help low-income people enter the trade. You have incubator programs, again, to help smaller businesses, and you try to have a wider variety in the marijuana industry. The other approach is being discussed right now at the federal level, is to try to have state control of the marijuana market, right? And that means you wouldn't have private actors. And that's not feasible right now at the state level precisely because of federal prohibition. Because if a state like New York tried to control the marijuana market, that would pose a direct conflict with federal law. State employees would be violating federal law. So they can't do that. So the only way forward at the state level has been the private sector. And that's why we're saying you need really, really strong regulations to control that industry that's coming into being.
So you're saying, just like, and I think people in New York may not know this, but I believe that in some states there aren't or there weren't liquor stores as we know them here. There were state, what they call package stores, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what you're talking about. The state would actually be the distributor of legal marijuana products.
And that's what Uruguay, we drafted the marijuana legalization bill in Uruguay. We were very involved in that. And they have national control. Canada has legalized marijuana nationwide, and they have a mixture there depending on the different provinces. That's not possible in the U.S. because of federal prohibition. So if you really want to address this problem, fight for federal legalization and state control.
Let's take a question from here in the Greene Space. Hi.
Hi, good morning. It's Anthony Zitrin. I would like you to talk about two things. One is the problem of driving while intoxicated with marijuana, and also the experience of Canada, which is relatively recent, and what lessons, if any, have we learned from Canada?
Maria, why don't you take the driving question, because that's obviously a challenge to legalizing advocates.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really that big of a difference because right now, like I said, 12% of New Yorkers are using marijuana and driving under the influence in some cases, right? So you're going to have people driving under the influence of marijuana no matter what.
But there would presumably be more people using, or do you dispute that?
There may be more people using, and that is a possible outcome, and you need to have very strong public education around that. Unfortunately, with marijuana, we have a real problem because we don't have a reliable test to tell you when somebody is impaired due to marijuana use while driving, right? A blood test only tells you whether someone consumed marijuana in the last month. So you don't want to just go there because it's overbroad. You might try some of those field sobriety tests, but those haven't fully been validated for marijuana as opposed to alcohol. So that needs to be developed. That needs more work and research. But obviously what you want to measure is impairment, and you do need very strong public education.
And let me go right to another question here in the Greene Space. Hi there.
Hi, I am all for decriminalization because I object to the idea of big corporations making money off of legalization. But we already have so many problems with, as you mentioned, Philip Morris, companies like Monsanto, putting things into products that we ingest to make people more addicted. I don't see what guarantee, even the FDA has been shown to allow things that are later harmful to human beings. I don't see what solution.
Your conclusion would be that the black market is actually safer for users.
Yeah, but I think even with the black market, there's no guarantee either way that addictive substances are not going to get into.
So if I can say something on that. So I think with legalization, you get the worst of both worlds. You get the black market, which, if you're going to use it, whether you're going to really want to use it now or if it becomes legal, you're going to find a way to use it and do it. And you're actually going to go to the cheaper source, which in Colorado and many other states has allowed the black market to thrive. But on top of the black market and all the problems it has, you then have Madison Avenue. And you then have the state lobbyists, and you have that problem as well. And the driving issue, let me just, for a minute on the driving, because we can't forget this. The deadliest crash in New York State history, which was the limo driver that killed 19 other people, including himself. The NTSB released the report and found very high levels of THC. They tested him 6 hours later. It's true THC can stay in your system for a while, but it rapidly declines in the first few hours.
But under the criminal regime.
Yeah, but the point is, this is a problem, and we're acting as if legalization doesn't affect people's, ability or desire to use. If you get rid of speed limits, not everybody is going to drive 85 all the time, but many people will because you've gotten rid of it. In New York City, and I live around the corner. I don't know about you all in the audience, but there is just because of this discussion, I feel, maybe I'm in the minority, that there is a markedly increased secondhand smoke exposure and marijuana everywhere I go.
We're almost
that's a huge issue.
We're going to run out of time soon. And Kevin, I want to make sure to raise for you probably the biggest argument against the decriminalization path that I hear, which is that it's just still going to keep ensnaring black and brown people at absolutely unacceptable rates because we see it happening in the decriminalization states now.
I'm really glad you asked that because let me tell you something. We need major criminal justice reform. The idea that if we legalize marijuana, that somehow we're not anymore going to have racist criminal justice policies. There aren't going to be 11 more things someone will book a kid for if they want to.
But there wouldn't be something as easy to attach it to.
Well, then let's decriminalize it. Well, then let's not have them go after that. And we don't have that in New York State, even though we have it on paper. We have not implemented it.
Maria, go ahead.
We did decriminalize in 1977. We've had it for decades. Commissioner Bratton, years ago, actually did order it be implemented. And you still had tens of thousands of arrests in New York City.
Arrests have gone up in Colorado,
800,000 arrests have declined dramatically in the states that
for youth, the annual average arrest rate for youth, and especially black and Hispanic youth, have gone up in Colorado because they're using it at school, which you're not allowed to do under legalization. They're using it in public. They're driving with it. Yes, overall numbers for adults, but we're still criminalizing young black youth in Colorado because we're focusing on this narrow issue. Criminal justice is a massive issue, and we're distracted by marijuana.
Give me your take on that, because if we have a dispute on the facts, it's important to get both sides out.
Look, overall numbers of arrests in the states that have legalized have declined dramatically. It did not happen in New York when it decriminalized. You still have, like I said, in 20 years, 800,000 plus arrests. Drug possession as a whole is the single most arrested offense in the United States. People are arrested for drug possession 4 times as often as for all violent crimes combined. Is that a good use of law enforcement resources?
Fix that, but don't give it over to Philip Morris. I mean, that's all I'm saying. Don't give it over to Big Pharma.
And I'm not giving it over to Big Pharma or Philip Morris. How about
you don't want
control? Yes.
Oh, last word, and then we're out of time.
What I'm saying is we need to take it out of the criminal justice system entirely, including for low-level sales, which are also a target of law enforcement, including for people on parole and probation who lose their release because they tested positive for marijuana. The only way to do that is legalization. And that is the only way also to establish a regulated market that can actually begin to address health concerns. And one final point. Right now, there are 72,000 plus Americans dying every year due to opioid-related or other overdoses. A lot of that has to do with adulteration of the supply, with the fact that fentanyl is in the supply of illegal drugs under prohibition. That has to do with the fact that the black market has no controls and everything gets poisoned.
The drug dealers aren't going away. We get big tobacco 2.0
That
with
is-
this. And why would we make the
We've seen
same?
a significant
Why would we make the
reduction
same mistake?
in marijuana crossing the border from Mexico into states that have...
Because they're growing heroin now. I don't think that's a good trade-off.
Nothing like ending on a crescendo. So we thank Maria McFarland Sánchez-Moreno and Kevin Sabet for this decriminalization versus legalization debate. Our Reefer Managed series continues all next week. And coming up after a break, we have Laurie Metcalf and Lucas Hnath on the play Hillary and Clinton. Stay tuned.
Can Cory Booker win the White House with this message?
We need a revival of civic grace. Yes, we need a more compassionate empathy. We are tearing each other apart as a country, and we need leaders that are not going to pit us against each other. We need leaders that are going to call us to a common purpose and a common cause again, because when I travel this country, I find so much common pain.
My interview with Senator Booker next time on The Takeaways Politics with Amy Walter, Fridays at 3 on 93.9 FM.
Support for WNYC comes from Roger McNamee, author of Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe, the story of a tech venture capitalist and early mentor to Mark Zuckerberg who wakes up to Facebook's influence on and implications for society. Available everywhere books are sold. Dada Films, presenting William. When two scientists experiment with cloning, the limits of nature versus nurture are put to the test by William. Now playing at the Village East Cinemas, Q&A tonight with filmmaker Tim Disney. WNYC is a media partner of Brooklyn Public Library, introducing Photo Requests from Solitary, an exhibition on what people in solitary confinement want to see, opening April 20th, bklynlibrary.org/BPL presents.
This is WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Lehrer on WNYC, live on the Greene Space stage today as part of the 24-hour 10th anniversary Greene Space Marathon, which started at 7 o'clock this morning and will go continuously through 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. And when we're on the Greene Space stage doing the show, you can watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen, because we stream live video. You can go to the WNYC website. I'm waving hello now to the people who are already watching, WNYC.org, or go to our Facebook page. And one reason you might want to watch at this particular moment is that with me now in the Greene Space Marathon, I'm so happy to have the actor, Laurie Metcalf, now starring on Broadway in the play called Hillary and Clinton. And we have the playwright, Lucas Hnath. Hillary and Clinton has another few days in previews and will officially open next Thursday at the John Golden Theater. So great of both of you to come in. Welcome to the Greene Space and WNYC. Lucas, give our listeners some background on the play. This takes place around the New Hampshire primary in 2008. When and why did you write it?
I actually first wrote the play 10 years ago, and I think I started writing it before the primary cycle was even finished. And I was really struck by this moment in the campaign where Hillary's numbers were really, really bad. She had just lost Iowa and had gone into New Hampshire, and that there was this luncheon where somebody asked her a question about balancing family and work and running for the presidency, and a lot of people perceived her to start crying. People thought she had started crying during the speech, and that when she won New Hampshire, her win was attributed to that moment. And I thought there was something really odd and unsettling that people's opinions about you might completely flip if you show a certain emotion in a certain way.
So we pulled that real-life clip from just before the New Hampshire primary in 2008 because it becomes such a central part of the play, as you were just describing. And again, the context is that Clinton is trailing in the polls to Barack Obama, and she's seen as cold and not likable and all those things people have said about her. And then in one public appearance, she tears up as she answers a question. Here's the crucial minute.
You know, I have so many opportunities from this country. I just don't want to see us fall backwards. You know, so, you know, this is very personal for me. It's not just political, it's not just public. I see what's happening, and we have to reverse it. And some people think elections are a game. They think it's like who's up or who's down. It's about our country, it's about our kids' futures, and it's really about all of us together. You know, some of us put ourselves out there and do this against some pretty difficult odds. And we do it, each one of us, because we care about our country. But some of us are right and some of us are wrong. Some of us are ready and some of us are not. Some of us know what we will do on day one, and some of us haven't really thought that through enough.
And I went back and read the news clips from around then, and sure enough, that's how it was reported at the time, that moment flipped the result of the New Hampshire primary, and she won. Laurie, did you listen to that clip to help prepare you for the role?
Yeah, I had heard that, and I loved hearing the, what I thought was the emotion, you know, in her voice, but also the weariness, you know, the tiredness. And then in the play, I say maybe it was allergies, maybe my eyes watered up because of that, or I was up till 4 a.m. So it's a mystery to her why it was interpreted that way.
Although I did notice that she quickly got back on message and attacked Obama as not ready to be president. It's got to be tough to play Hillary Clinton with everybody possibly ready to judge you from the point of view of their own politics. Why did you want to take on this challenge?
Well, I didn't feel that it was a challenge personally. Anything that comes to me with Lucas's name on it, I'm in. I've already signed up, and I want to work on it. And then on the title page, Lucas asks that whoever does these parts of the Clintons do not do a literal impersonation. And so that was comforting to me, because if I was asked to do an impersonation, I wouldn't be in the play because I wouldn't be able to do that. But also it was very freeing because it gave us, all the actors, a free pass to interpret these characters on our own. What the audiences bring in, preconceived notions about all 4 characters on stage, I have no idea. But I'm thinking that when they leave, it could be affected.
Mm-hmm. Could be changed. Some of our listeners, and you just said how you would do anything with Lucas' name on it. Some of our listeners know that you two worked together so successfully just recently on the play A Doll's House Part 2. Lucas, you wrote it. Laurie, you won a Best Actress Tony Award for the lead character Nora. Congratulations. Why do you like working with each other? Lucas, you want to go first?
The way that I write dialogue and the way that I write monologues, it's really hard to just simply say the language. They're very dense. There's a lot of complicated trains of thought that you're following. And Laurie has this magnificent ability to make thinking visible. You can really see her train of thought on her face and in her body as she's performing, you know, in some cases, 5-minute long monologues, or and it's a really rare quality. And then also to do that without sacrificing a certain amount of emotion.
And Laurie, the original Nora character in A Doll's House is sort of a seminal feminist role, right? A supportive wife who starts to lean into being seen as more fully human in her own right and pays some prices, or maybe you'd put it differently, but what's the relationship, if any, between you two doing this play right after that play?
Oh, I don't know, because one thing that the strongest thing that pops into my mind, besides having two super strong female leads, is that they're both marriage plays, and Lucas's different takes on what it means to be in a marriage, and two people that have been through quite a bit together in both plays. I find that fascinating too.
Lucas, you're a guy who has written a play that is significantly about gender and presidential politics, and really A Doll's House Part 2 before that too, in the context of a marriage. How do you work to be not inadvertently tone deaf on gender issues?
Very hard. The thing that I'm often channeling, my mother, who's really probably easily the most important person in my life. She, when I was a kid, she went to seminary to become a minister, and when I was a kid, a lot of other kids I knew would tell me, oh, well, your mother's breaking God's rules by going to seminary. Women shouldn't be ministers. And so from an early age, I was empathizing with this and sort of a little bit in the middle of this fight where I found myself fighting and defending my mother's right to go to seminary. And I can't help but think there's a relationship between that moment and seeing what she went through, and both Hillary and Clinton in A Doll's House Part 2.
Fascinating. Do you know that your competition last night was the real Bill and Hillary doing a stage talk together at the Beacon Theater? How surreal is that?
I heard about that, yes. It is. It's really surreal, and I know that she's been going to some shows in the area, and so it's funny to kind of know that she's around and there's this marquee, and yeah, it's really strange.
But in the play, which I saw last week, much different from the Beacon, I'm sure, there's a lot of Hillary and Bill arguing with each other. You portray a lot of anger in the relationship, and is it because, and Laura, you could take this from an actor's perspective, is it because people must imagine how angry Hillary has been at Bill over the years for the affairs and for having to cover for him and everything, and now they get to see a version of it acted out in a fictional play, which they would never get to see in real life?
Well, those things do come up. They talk about, old things are dredged up in the show, and rightful anger comes out during those times. But the other arguments that they have is about the campaign. Not that it's, deep down, it's still about their marriage, but Bill wants to take Hillary a certain way, and her campaign manager, Mark Penn, wants to go another way. And so she is having to choose between these two people who care about her very much, but are trying to force their will on her. And she's sort of at sea in the sense that she's feeling like she's losing her own instincts about how she should wage this war herself.
And I should say the play has 4 characters: Hillary, Bill, Obama, and Hillary's 2008 campaign manager, Mark Penn. And Lucas, I'd say Bill Clinton, played by John Lithgow, does not come off well. Narcissistic and deceptive and condescending, I guess I'd say. What were you trying to show about Bill Clinton?
I mean, I don't know if I approached it in terms of trying to show something about him, but it felt like there was a reckoning that needed to happen that has been bubbling up, and to ignore it would be really, I think, pretty tone deaf. So I think it came out of that.
The meaning to the public of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaigns is so different now from what it was in 2008 when you wrote this play, or what it was in 2016 before Trump won. And I know it was staged during the campaign in Chicago. Have you rewritten one or more times to reflect the change in context? Because it's really so different.
Yeah, when the thought of even doing this play on Broadway came up, I told our producer Scott Rudin that I would want to entirely rewrite the play, not actually with respect to 2016 as much as it was 10 years ago that I first wrote the play. I think I'm a very different writer now. And so in this past summer, I started from page 1 and wrote the play again from memory. But also made a point of every time that I found myself winking at 2016 too much, I would step back away from that, because if it was obvious, I think it probably didn't want to be in the play.
Interesting. Laurie, as many of our listeners know, you've had an amazing career in television and on Broadway and in film. You've won Tonys the last 2 years for Doll's House Part 2 and 3 Tall Women. You've won 3 Emmys for your role on the original Roseanne, and you've had Oscar nominations. Do you like doing one more than another medium or differently from one another?
Oh, for me, it's all about the theater.
It is.
Yes. That's my my first love, and maybe because I started out in theater, but it's where I feel the most comfortable. I love the rehearsal process, and then I love still digging around every night. 8 shows a week during the whole run. It's it's an ever evolving form to me, and I get very self-conscious of having a camera in my face, and so I feel much more freer on the stage.
It's very taxing, though, right? I mean, this play must be very strenuous to perform, constant, fast dialogue and with a lot of emotion, and it's short. It was only, I think, an hour and a quarter when I was there the other night, but it's intense. And to do that 8 times a week, what is that like?
It's mentally, you have to be very dexterous, and it's a little draining to focus for that long at the pitch that the play is set at. It's not physically taxing, but mentally it really is. But it's also such a rush to do, and for me, I don't really leave the stage, so it goes by in a flash for me.
People are wondering, I'm sure. So you were in the spotlight recently for the ill-fated Roseanne reboot with you as her liberal sister. It continues with you. I'm trying to frame a non-gossipy question about that, and I guess it's...
Good luck.
Did the show aim to bridge an important cultural divide, and could something like that succeed in pop culture?
Oh, when we did the initial reboot? Yes, I think it did. I don't think that the show is going to be centered on politics at all, but it was so prevalent when we came back that it was a topic that we couldn't ignore, and I think it was brilliant of the writers to put that fissure right in the middle of a tight-knit family and show what it could cause. But then ultimately within that pilot episode, the sisters got down to what their real falling out had been about, and it wasn't really about who voted for who.
Lucas, the play has been shown in various places since 2008. As we said before, have Bill or Hillary ever seen or said anything about it?
I don't think they've ever seen it, and I've sort of I like to sort of be in a bubble and not know what the real people think. So, because in a way, the play's not about the real people. It's sort of these mythic reinterpretations of them. So I've been very careful to not confuse the two for myself.
How do you walk the line for yourself between fiction or documentary? Because a lot of what is depicted in the play is real, but when I went back and read up on that history, some of the events were slightly changed.
Yeah, I mean, and the play has a little prologue at the top, a speech at the top where Laurie comes out and talks to the audience about multiverses and says that, just imagine this place set on a different planet Earth. It's really similar. But I took a couple of given circumstances, and then I just sort of felt my way through it and tried to imagine myself in their shoes.
Somebody asked me if you feel any obligation to alert the Clintons to the play in any way, since it's about them. And they're still alive and public figures.
They do know about it. They do know about it. I just don't know what they think.
Laurie, what else you got coming up? You want to plug anything?
No, I'm looking forward to opening and settling into the run. Oh, and then the Connors is going to do another 13 episodes, I think.
Please thank Laurie Metcalf and Lucas Hnath, the playwright of Hillary and Clinton, which officially opens next Thursday at the John Golden Theater on Broadway. Thank you so much for joining us at the Greene Space. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Audience, thank you so much for coming out. And the Greene Space Marathon continues. Events for free until 7 a.m.